Hack Outbreak is the third installment in the 4-part JRPG series, what I and many others refer to as IMOQ, that breathed the glorious breath of life starting way back in 2002. Man, I'm old. As many of you should know by now, IMOQ is my all-time favorite series. My love for the series blossomed in high school, especially when my parents decided to transfer me to another one starting junior year. I was an angsty teenager who was pretty happy with the group of friends I had, and was stupidly determined not to make any new ones at this stupid new school. I eventually did, but IMOQ was a big part of what got me through this self-imposed loneliness. I was in the perfect headspace to allow myself to get lost in a world so rich in storytelling and context, with characters that felt almost like real friends. Sad, I know. But that's the power of great writing and storytelling, and that's why I love this series more than any other, no matter how much flashier or objectively better some others might be, especially in terms of gameplay mechanics. What I look for in any game, and what IMOQ in my humble opinion executes better than most other games, is excellent storytelling. Having said all that, I want to talk about the writing as well as many other aspects of this great game. So let's start with the writing. In Outbreak, it only gets better. I think with an epic-sized narrative like the one IMOQ takes on, one that the writers must develop within the confines of the world, as well as in the real one, seriously, that's fucking impressive, there are some risks involved, one of the main ones being in the exposition. In order to tell a whale of a tale, you've got to lay a lot of groundwork in the exposition, which could tire out any writer and result in a top-heavy narrative riddled with a lot of context and development in the first part that eventually fizzles out into loose ends and dropped storylines as we approach the end. I think Infection, the first game in the series, does an excellent job at setting us up for the key developments that happen throughout the series. Mutation picks up from where Infection leaves us and further develops and ultimately complicates what we know to be true about the world and who we are in it. The writers clearly have a good eye for causality, which is what separates excellent writing from mediocre. I bring this up every chance I get, but the writers of South Park gave a famous lecture at NYU where they point out that bad writing follows the "and then" formula. This happens, and then this happens, and then this happens. Excellent writing fleshes out the causal relationships between the various points of development, and the writers of IMOQ clearly demonstrate a mastery of this. I was worried that Outbreak would get the middle child treatment in terms of writing, that we'd see a lot of fluff and filler just to carry us through to the exciting conclusion in Part 4. I'm glad that my worries were for naught. And so the writing proceeds masterfully in Outbreak. We get some really interesting developments like Balmung's change of heart. I want to highlight this one specifically because I was wrong. During my playthrough, I like to throw spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks. No ideas or interpretations are off limits. I find that it helps immensely when I actually get to the business of writing my review. So I guess you can kind of see my playthroughs as very rough drafts for the review. And what's really helpful with my playthrough of IMOQ is that I actually have diehard fans with a much greater knowledge base than my own commenting on my videos. And credit for the following revision to my original assessment goes to DawnSeeker176. I really appreciate your input, especially when we disagree. In the first part of my Outbreak playthrough, there's an excellent scene between Kite and Balmung. Kite gets to the bottom of a dungeon in an infected area, and to no one's surprise, there's a data bug. But the surprise is in who we find already in the heat of battle with the aforementioned data bug, none other than Balmung. As we all know, data bugs are extremely dangerous monsters with virtually infinite hit points. Even though Balmung is one of the strongest players in the world, he is effectively powerless against this enemy. Kite steps in and helps dispatch with this monster, and then the fateful scene ensues. Now, I first read the scene as Balmung admitting some jealousy toward Kite and his illegal skill, and while I do still think jealousy may exist somewhere in Balmung's heart, DawnSeeker176 points out that I read too much into this scene here, which is absolutely correct. I was projecting too much of my own reading of Balmung's character into the scene and basically seeing what I wanted to see. That's my bad. I was beginning to very unartfully flesh out a reading of Balmung's character, but to show where that interpretation still might have some validity, I want to put on my English major cap and do a close reading of the scene, further informed by Balmung's backstory. After the conclusion of the battle, Kite scolds Balmung by saying, "Are you nuts fighting it alone?" A fair question. Balmung does not possess the illegal skill necessary to rewrite the infected monster's data so that it can revert back to its game-sanctioned parameters. Kite does. With the rumors flying around the BBS about players encountering monsters like this and going comatose, it seems like Balmung has a death wish, or at best, he's bullheadedly engaging in an exercise in futility. In response to Kite's very fair question, Balmung asks Kite why he bothered to step in and help. After all, Balmung, quote, scorned Kite when he and Black Rose both fought bravely. He goes on to say that he is, quote, guilty of resorting to more cowardly means. This last bit refers to his underhanded tactics with Leos in Mutation to thwart Kite's efforts and have his character data deleted. Now what I see here is a self-righteous character who unfairly judges Kite and his allies and sides with the system admins because he has a naive, legalistic view of the world. Balmung sees Kite as equal to the virus that put his most trusted companion into a coma and is wreaking havoc upon the rest of the world, and he lets his hatred for the bracelet cloud his judgment. But then Balmung has to swallow an insanely tough truth pill. He's the one who resorted to underhanded tactics and acted cowardly. The guy who is known as one of the descendants of Fianna and is admired throughout the world did something antithetical to what he wanted his character to be. He backslides down the slippery slope of the ends justify the means and hates where it's taken him. Balmung up to this point focuses so much on the illegal actions of others like Kite and Helba, but the events in Mutation force him to turn the mirror back on himself and reflect. Perhaps that's why he goes on this fool's errand. I think there are multiple things going on here within Balmung's emotional landscape, and again, this demonstrates some really excellent writing and character work. I think on some level Balmung is punishing himself. From the sense I get of his character, he doesn't like to be in the wrong. He has an incredibly strong sense of justice, so to find out that he was the one who did wrong, and more importantly, that a system admin, someone who is supposed to be an arbiter of justice within the world and a protector of it, drove him to do it, would eat away at him. Blood was spilled and a price must be paid. So he shows up to a fight he knows full well he can't win as an act of penance for the sins he commits against Kite. But again, I think that's only part of what brings him to this dungeon. I also still think he wants to help restore the world. He indicates as much in what he says to Kite. Quote, I want to restore this world, and like you, I want to help Orca as well. But as I've been saying in my earlier reviews, though we are told that, we also see it right before our eyes. Balmung wants to prove to himself, and maybe to others as well, that he's still Balmung of the Azure Sky. At the very least, if he's got the monster's attention, no one else has to fall into a coma or worse. When others would flee or stay out of that infected area entirely, Balmung runs right toward imminent peril because he, quote, couldn't just ignore it. He may have lost himself in hatred for a moment, but he's still pretty fucking admirable. Now where do I see the jealousy? This is pure interpretation on my part, though trying to determine intentionality behind anyone's words and actions is going to rely a lot on interpretation. But here's why I see jealousy. I see a lot of the loyal son from the prodigal son parable in Balmung. Hear me out and understand that this is my reading of Balmung. You may disagree, and quite reasonably so, but this is just what I see as some of the inner workings that lead Balmung to do what he does, especially the things that don't seem to align with who Balmung is on the surface. Balmung's not a normal player. He never has been. He was one of the original beta testers back in the days of Fragment, and has invested so much time and effort into the finished product of the game that he is known as one of the legendary descendants of Fianna. He's been a ride or die with the world since its very beginnings, so it should go without saying that the world is precious to him, and based on how he acts within the world, I don't think it's an unreasonable assumption to make that he thinks he is precious to the world. All that being said, it's not like he works for CC Corp or has any official relationship with the organization. In that regard, he is a normal player. Despite that, he assumes an unreasonable responsibility for the well-being of the world and its players, in no small part due to the backstory I just mentioned, as well as how he RPs his character. I think it's incredibly telling that he names his character after the legendary sword of Siegfried, and not the hero himself. With that significantly reductive name choice, he literally objectifies himself ever in service of the preservation of a just, ideal version of the world. He actually serves as a nice parallel to Silver Knight and .Haxine, especially if we consider how Silver Knight went too far in terms of dealing with Tsukasa and resorted to operating from the shadows as well. Enter Morgana and the Cursed Wave. Balmung, the character, possesses the strength to protect the other players of the world from the likes of PKers and scammers. He can even protect players from tough monsters in dangerous areas. But in IMOQ, Balmung comes face to face with his own impotence. He can't save his trusted companion, and he can't protect the world from whatever is corrupting it. Enter Kite, some nobody who relies not on his own power, but some illegal skill. But he's actually doing something. Now, Kite will have his own demons to wrestle with in terms of the unforeseen impacts his actions have on the world, as well as the real world. But Kite was given the power to find a cure. Where I see jealousy at least taking root is in the fact that Balmung is all but useless in these circumstances. He can't even be the sword he named himself after, an unrivaled, trusty blade forged to cut through and put to rout all evil. He has been reduced to, at best, a shield. And Kite, who has come to embody everything Balmung hates and sees as a threat to the world, possesses the power to actually do something. And I do think he hates the Twilight Bracelet and Kite's illegal skill. I don't think he's jealous of that, because Balmung hates anything outside the system. That's not what I'm saying. But Kite has been clear about his intentions since day one. He wants to save the world and save Orca. Balmung knows all of this, and yet he resorts to underhanded methods with Leos in order to trap Kite and have his character data deleted once and for all. I think a large part of the motivation comes from his blind sense of justice. That tracks. But I can't help but see some jealousy and pettiness, especially since Balmung usually calls wrongdoers out boldly and doesn't normally resort to working from the shadows. I don't think it's unreasonable to entertain the notion that Balmung might see Kite going about his efforts and reflect on how little his own loyalty to the world and commitment to preserving justice all this time actually rewards him in his own efforts to deal with Morgana and the Cursed Wave. Kinda like the loyal son who stays with the dad in the prodigal son parable. Kite, of course, isn't anything like the prodigal son. But both Balmung and the brother in that parable view their counterparts as usurpers with invalid claims to the privileged positions they hold. Anyway, that's just a reading. An interpretation based upon character actions, words, and backstory, nothing more. But if this ridiculously lengthy diatribe demonstrates one thing, it's the masterful character work the writers do. Balmung's is not the only intricately woven emotional tapestry that is worth exploring. And the writers do such a good job even with the secondary characters. They don't get the all-star treatment, but they're all still interesting in their own ways, and there's depth there too. That doesn't always happen in games with large casts of playable characters. And what little we do get in terms of characterization for the secondary characters is so effective in presenting them as unique, interesting party members. Really, I have nothing bad to say about the writing here. So let's move on to the gameplay. We see even more boss fights in Outbreak, and even the return of one particularly pesky one who won't stop running away. Yeah, I'm calling you out, Kubia. You ain't so tough. And the boss battles again do a nice job of breaking up the routine of normal gameplay by requiring a fair amount of strategy. Vigil hits the party where it hurts, with elemental spells. If you've left yourself or party members vulnerable to any of the elements, you're not going to have very much fun with this one. And I like how this one is slightly different from some of the boss battles in Mutation. In that game, the devs introduced extra components and conditions to boss battles. Magus would shed leaves that then exploded and dealt critical amounts of damage if you didn't take care of them in a timely manner. That fight demanded that you change up how you approached a boss battle. The Vigil fight in Outbreak brings us back to some of the subtler elements of gameplay with a focus on exploiting your lack of attention to elemental resistance. Both fights demonstrate different but equally effective ways at disrupting business as usual and keeping players on their back foot during boss fights, which I would argue all boss fights should strive to do. Now I do have to mention the Kubia fight. There are technically two parts to it. In the first stage of battle, the Kubia core has 2000 HP, in the second stage, the core has 5000 HP. The major problem I see is that there is no meaningful transition between the two stages. The music doesn't change, there's no cutscene, you could blink and miss it and just assume you mistook the 5 for a 2. After two little rumble effects that shake the screen and having Kubia move a bit closer to the players, they just slap a near-identical boss fight right on top of the old one. There are really only two differences. More Gamora spawn around the core, and Kubia has a few more skills, and they're stronger. But again, I just think the little things they use to signify the transition from one part in the boss battle to the next are way too insignificant. Now, we don't need a 15-minute long DBZ level transformation scene, but I think there has to be something to indicate to us, "Ha! You thought you had the upper hand, but I haven't even shown you my final form!" Other than that, we get some pretty nice updates to the gameplay mechanics in the forms of Grunty Search and 2128 Drain. Grunty Search calls upon the powers of your Grunties to ferret out items, magic portals, and dungeon entrances when you're in a field area. While it's nothing earth-shattering, it's a nice touch to get more interaction with the Grunties you raise on each server. 2128 Drain is a much more useful version of Data Drain in that it increases the likelihood of acquiring rare items from Data Drain targets. That's actually really useful, especially when you're toward the end of the game searching for the best equipment for your party. Those infection levels can get pretty high pretty fast, but I'll make the same complaint I made with Data Drain Arc. The animation sequence has no cosmetic differences from any of the other iterations of Data Drain. It's disappointing to say the least. If we're supposed to see each new iteration of data drain as a shiny new thing, you'd think there would be something to signify that other than skill point cost. This last criticism took a while to crystallize, but it's been true since Infection. The game's combat can get pretty repetitive. Now, I freely admit I'm part of the problem. I could bring along more equipment to make strategic changes based on enemy weaknesses and elemental advantages to spice up the gameplay. I'm well aware my unartful playstyle contributes to a more monotonous experience, but I do think there are mechanic issues inherent in the overall combat experience. For starters, bringing along extra equipment would actually rely on opening both the party menu and the player menu more often. If you haven't seen what this experience is like, it is the textbook definition of tedium. There are no shortcuts. There's no combination input that will take you directly to skills, or to equipment, or to items. You have to go from the top of the menu every single time. It just gets old and repetitive. I would much rather the interface remember the last page I was on and pick up there. To be fair, there is at least some remembering involved, but only after you get to a sub-menu. For those that aren't familiar with the interface, I'm calling the top of the player menu the main menu. Once you've made a selection such as skills or items, the design of the menu looks like folders in a file cabinet, which I call the sub-menu. You still have to open the player menu from the top and select skills every time you want to use a skill. After that, it will remember which sub-menu you last selected from, which does alleviate some of the tedium. The party menu is actually slightly better because it's basically designed as one big sub-menu. That being the case, it will pick up in whatever section you were last in upon pulling it up again. So there are some small things that make interacting with the menu interface less tedious, but it's still pretty goddamn tedious. And it can get more than a little old having to stop and start battle numerous times to do something other than whack a thing to death. Kinda reminds me of trying to get through even the simplest of combat scenarios in my more litigious D&D groups. If there were even a shortcut command to recast the last skill used. But I digress. All in all, Outbreak is everything we need it to be to ramp us up to the amazing conclusion we will get in Quarantine. My worries that the writing would flag and we would see a bunch of filler and fluff were clearly unnecessary. I think when I initially played IMOQ way back when, Outbreak was my least favorite for whatever reason. Hey, the middle child is the hardest to love. But now I think it might be my favorite. The writing has been strong and engrossing since the beginning, but I really think they bottled lightning in Outbreak. Though the gameplay is nowhere close to perfection, the point of IMOQ, at least for me, has always been to get lost in the world and to fall in love with the lifelike characters.